Oh boy. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is RuffledRowlit, and welcome back to a brand new video. It's really blowing outside, like the wind is going crazy, man. There's also a train in the background, there's a bunch of family of mine just downstairs just yelling like crazy. But ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brand new video. My name is Jimmy Neutron, and today we're going to talk about some things about Gamefreak and Pokemon in general, as well as just the kind of where Gamefreak is going with their plans now, and it's kind of an interesting thing. So this came out from PokeJungle as a post about Gamefreak prioritizing original games over Pokemon. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's basically them wanting to prioritize brand new IPs, aka brand new intellectual properties, brand new games, so to say, and brand new franchises over just Pokemon, which in one way, it's a logical prospect, right? It's a logical thing to do. You take the name of Gamefreak, right, which has a huge impact within the gaming community. Just in the general world, Gamefreak is a company that has a lot of, staying power. It has a lot of strength and, all that. So if you take that name and try to use that to your advantage to make other games besides just Pokemon, that's a logical, prospect. But the problem is, though, Gamefreak is already lacking behind in their own production of Pokemon games, that I feel worried if they're gonna take priority on brand new IPs. Shouldn't you first make sure that Pokemon games to begin with are good, and then start working on other IPs? Because you gotta make sure that one of your franchises that is the most popular is getting better and not worse. Which right now, in all fairness, you gotta be honest, Pokemon isn't really getting better. They've been stuck in this loop for a long time now, ever since X and Y, where they don't really, they kind of keep, repeating shit, or they just aren't really making any strides. For example, the graphics haven't really changed much, the general gameplay hasn't changed much, the actual, just general improvements are getting less and less, there's just less features being added, less things in the games, less new things being tried, there's less, old features that people want being added in. Let's just bring it up again for the millionth time, the Battle Frontier. It's something that people really, really loved. It's a feature that is a good feature. Maybe it's not the best thing in the world, but it's a good feature and people do like it and want it, but they won't add that in again. And the thing is, they don't seem to come up with good replacements for it. They come up with replacements that are just kind of lesser versions of it and stuff like that. Or if sometimes they will come up with good replacements, but generally speaking, we haven't had a content-rich Pokemon game in ages. Look at Oras wasn't content-rich. X and Y wasn't really content-rich either. Sun and Moon, not that either. If we count outside of, the base story, the games were pretty, point A, point B, you're done, right? Post-game was pretty lackluster, and that's kind of what I mean, content-wise, because usually post-game will encapsulate all the other aspects of Pokemon besides just the general story, right? It will encapsulate all the other aspects, like Wi-Fi battling, shiny hunting, etc., etc., etc. And we're now, with Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee, that got even worse. That's where I really saw that they really gave no crap about making any extra features for Pokemon, even for a remake. And you might make the argument about, oh, it's a remake, and back in, those days, they didn't have extra things in the end. True, but they did have it in the Fire Red Leaf Green remakes, which were a remake of Gen 1. They did have these extra cool, cooler things, interesting things, etc., 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 and had more features, that were interesting. But they didn't in Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee, because they're just getting a little bit lazy on that side when it comes to making interesting features. And that's why I love Heart Gold, Soul Silver, because I think Heart Gold, Soul Silver encapsulates what Game Freak should be about, which is to make a super content-rich game with tons of things. Heart Gold, Soul Silver were that. They were that game that had everything you wanted in a Pokemon game, and it was perfect. 2 regions, tons of Pokemon, Battle Frontier, Jeez, there's just so much shit in there, okay? There's so many things. And that's where I get worried when I read this right here. So let's read through it. Now, Game Freak prioritizing original games over Pokemon. So let's see what they talk about here. The developer of the main Pokemon series, Game Freak, has offered some insight into the development structure within the company. In an interview with VGC, they talked about the teams that make up the company and their new R&D division, which have helped them to develop even more games simultaneously. Now, Pokemon Sword and Shield are not the only Nintendo Switch games coming from the developers. They're also working on a new game tentatively called Town. Now, we've known about Town since last year, when it was revealed in last year's Nintendo Direct. We've known about this game. I remember when it was shown, I was just like, this is really weird. Like, I thought we were going to get a new generation, like, you know, shown, or more gameplay for this thing or that thing, you know, shown. But we weren't. We were shown this. And I remember being like, okay, I mean, it looks fine. I mean, it looks interesting, but I have no clue what it is or what the deal is with it. But this is where you need to keep in mind then. I have been talking about this for a long time now, and people always kind of like, you know, disregard, you know, what I say. But I've been saying for a long time that they're clearly working on tons of things at the same time. Like, I was saying that at some point, they were at least working on 4 to 5 games at the same time, with a studio that's getting to, you know, starting to expand, getting even more and more employees. Which people keep telling me, like, oh, there's only about 100. No, there's far more, because they hire people in, and those, of course, those people, you know, go to other things later on. But, like, the thing is, they're clearly expanding and trying to do more things, and that worries me, because that feels to me like they're not going to put enough effort in there to make the Pokemon games as good as they can be, and make that stride that we're waiting for. We're waiting for Pokemon to make that leap, right? Because here's the thing, right? And I think this is why people are like not that excited maybe, or a bit angry about the graphics in Sword and Shield, is because they feel like they were expecting that jump that you saw when we went from like black and white to X and Y. That feeling of being like, holy moly, we have a 3D Pokemon game. You know, that's the thing people are expecting. And of course, there's people who hate Generation 6 due to its like some lackluster areas. There are people who hate Generation 7. I don't hate it, but I don't like it either. Because of its issues and stuff like that. And then there are people who hate Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee, and stuff like that. I dislike Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee, because I feel like that encapsulates them kind of not wanting to kind of make this leap and try other things out, and that is really frustrating. But let's continue with the article. So according to the director and programmer Masayuki Onoue, there are 2 different production teams here, simply named Production Team 1 and Production Team 2. Team 1 is fully dedicated to Gear Project, while Team 2 is for the Pokemon operation. What that means is that Gamefreak as a company is prioritizing Gear Project, which is production team number 1, more than Pokemon in general. We're always trying to create something that's equally exciting or more exciting than Pokemon, which is fair enough. Now, Gear Project, I think, refers to like this this game right here. You guys may recognize this if we can just load these images. This is like the game Giga Wrecker, which is a game that Game Freak's working on. I can't even see the images, but they're down here. It's Giga Wrecker. It's like a 2D side-scroller thing. So that, I know that game's come out. I'm not sure if it's popular at all. I don't think it's really something I'm going to play, personally. Not because, like, oh, you know, I don't want to play anything that Game Freak makes that isn't Pokemon, but it's just, like, it just isn't my cup of tea. So when it comes down to Game Freak, like, and in general, just all this stuff, I'm going to put it like this, okay? Like, clearly they want to do something, they want to work on other stuff, they want to work on other IPs, because relying on a single IP isn't a smart idea. I mean, look at, like, Blizzard, right? If you look at Blizzard prior to, you know, prior to being, like, picked up by, them dudes over there at Activision, before Blizzard Activision became a thing and it was just Blizzard, they had a bunch of IPs, right? They had Diablo, they had StarCraft, they had Warcraft, right? Those were the 3 franchises they basically had on their hands. And those are 3 big franchises in their own respects, right? Those are 3 different, you know, not a singular, but 3 different franchises. And of course, the top one of those was Warcraft, right? And then eventually World of Warcraft was the biggest one. And then they, you know, they kind of expanded from that with expansions and, you know, stuff. And World of Warcraft is kind of a conglomerate of its own today. And now it's also getting a re-release of Classic, which I'm hella excited for. But either way, the point I'm trying to get to is that from that point, right, that at that certain time frame, okay, at that certain time frame, they had still a bunch, like 3 franchises. That's not a small amount that were really big. StarCraft was like the pioneer of esports. Warcraft was like leading into World of Warcraft, and that was like the biggest game ever during like 2004, 2005, and 2006. It was like basically the size of what Fortnite is today. That's what World of Warcraft was back then when I was a kid. That's what World of Warcraft was. It was the big new thing that everybody was playing, whereas now it's more like Fortnite, and in 2009 that was like Minecraft, right? In 2010 more, like in 11, that's what Minecraft was then, you know? So World of Warcraft was once that one big game, and it still holds like a value today. There's still millions of people who play it, and millions of people are hyped to play the classic release of the game. You know, there's basically all that, right? Now, let's put that on the side, right? They have a bunch of franchises, but then you look at Game Freak, and what do Game Freak have? They have one franchise, and that's Pokemon, right? They have one franchise that's really huge and the biggest franchise they have, and also one of the biggest franchises in existence. And then they're probably feeling like, well, Pokemon's gonna keep going, and we already have Pokemon games coming out, and we already have our Pokemon thing going on, but why don't we try to make some other stuff and see if that can work out, right? Why don't we work on something different besides Pokemon, or else we're going to be stuck making Pokemon forever? Which I understand, but that gets, again, that's fully understandable, and I do appreciate them going, like, trying out something different. But what does worry me, though, okay, and what does get me worried, is that if they're going this other way, if they're trying these other things, doesn't that create a situation where they're putting less priority on making good Pokemon games and more priority on just trying to make brand new IPs? Alright, so next thing here. Gamefreak has previously published games such as Giga Wrecker, directed by Inoue, Tembo the Badass Elephant, and Harmo Knight, and more of a variety of platforms. Now, the only one here that I know of is Giga Wrecker, because I've heard of it. The other ones, I've never heard of these. Now, Inoue continues. There is a lot of back and forth between Team 1 and Team 2, he added. One of the interesting things that Team 2, which is dedicated to Pokemon, only knows about specific platforms. So with Team 2, engineers can learn about the other platforms they might not have touched before. By mixing up the teams, we were able to create this interesting synergy. It may sound like a bad thing to some, but what this means is that the developers at Gamefreak are regularly being challenged to create new ideas and mechanics, something that's something vital to keep our favorite Pokemon franchise fresh. If the studio focused solely on Pokemon, it would be undoubtedly make for a more monotonous experience in the long run. Not all of those, not all of you may feel like it's a good thing though. Feel free to leave your own thoughts in the comments below, and also join our discussion. Alright, so here's what I'm gonna say, right? This is like kind of my final kind of breakdown of this, okay? And I agree. On one side, it's good for them to try new things out, because then that can give them better ideas for Pokemon, right? They can try out different, like, things, like, oh, you know, instead of making an RPG, let's make a shooter game. Like, Game Freak just decides, let's make a shooter game. You know, Team 1 says, okay, we want to work on a shooter game. They take aspects there, and they realize, huh, this is a pretty cool feature. And then they, you know, they have their discussions with Team 2, and Team 2 is like, oh, yeah, we're working on the Pokemon game, and blah, blah. They're like, oh, cool, well, we discovered that you can do this and this thing when developing Project X, right? And then the Team 2 can be like, with Pokemon, like, huh, that's a pretty interesting, what if we tried that in Pokemon? What if we tried taking that thing and tried it in Pokemon? In that way, you can kind of create new, unique things for Pokemon. But also, the issue that comes in is that if Pokemon is seen as, like, the secondary thing that's important to them, the second, that doesn't take priority, right, over everything else, that makes me worried that they're not thinking as much about it as they're thinking about trying new things out. But then again, that isn't probably how it is. I'm just, like, being too skeptical and too worried about these things, but in reality, they understand what they're doing, and they know what they're doing, and they're not, like, just, you know, just jumping around like little, like, rabbits, just totally not understanding, or, like, you know, chickens without their heads, you know. Like, I think they understand what they're going for. The only problem is, it just doesn't feel very comfortable hearing this after what we got with the last few games. Sun and Moon wasn't good in my opinion. I personally think the games were good. I think they made a lot of mistakes. There was a lot of mistakes with those games, in a lot of aspects, and I feel like they could have just done, so much with those games, and, like, I feel like they just didn't understand what they were doing in the early parts of the game. The pacing was off, but then there were other aspects of Sun and Moon that were good. But then also, they encapsulated a lot of issues with Pokemon. Like, for example, nowadays, legendary Pokemon are useless. Mythical Pokemon are useless. These things are, maybe to some of you, minuscule, but to me, they're important. Like, legendary Pokemon should be legendary. They're meant to be legendary. This is something that they've kind of forgotten now. They don't understand that legendary Pokemon is meant to be legendary. Ever since, like, what? Gen 5 almost, we don't really have legendaries being important to catch or interesting to catch nowadays. It's just kind of like, here you go, you get it for free, right? Before, you had to go through things to get them. Like, remember, like, trying to get Giratina? That, like, literally a whole world was made for that event, right? A bunch of crazy shit was made for that. Getting the Reggies back in Ruby Sapphire. To get those, you had to go through a series of, like, you know, weird little puzzles to get them, and that was freaking awesome. Like, the thing I'm trying to say is that, from one perspective, if they take the aspects of Pokemon that exist from, like, you know, or, like, they take aspects, sorry, from Team 1, that, like, interesting things that they can discover, because they do different programming, they do different platform development, right? Because they may be, you know, developing for even PlayStation and, like, you know, PC. Whereas Team 1 is making Pokemon and mainly making it on Switch and Nintendo consoles. Together, they can kind of, like, give each other's IDs, right? And that can give Pokemon some unique new concepts to work with. But at the same time, if Pokemon isn't prioritized, then that would explain why some of the games have been getting just kind of less and less interesting and just getting kind of more and more streamlined and handholdy than they should be. Not easier, but just more handholdy, right? Where you're not, like, just less and less freedom as well, honestly. Like, but then again, that's just what I think. I'd love to know your opinions, though, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching. let me know what you guys think about this. Are you worried, or are you okay with this? Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing? I'm kind of like on both sides. I think this is a good thing, but also it worries me that this could be the reason as to why they might go a little bit like wobbly at some point. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed. If you did, drop a like down below, and I'll see you all the next time. Bye.